Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, I'm joined by Dr. Cheryl Thompson, Associate Professor in Performance at the Creative School at Toronto Metropolitan University and the Director of Mapping Ontario's Black Archives. We'll be talking about her new book, Canada and the Blackface Atlantic, Performing Slavery, Conflict, and Freedom, 1812 to 1897, which is available now from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. From the War of 1812 to 18th century British immigration through to the Jim Crow era, we explore the ways in which blackface minstrelsy spread into Canada and how black choral groups and singers simultaneously reshaped entertainment to tell their own stories. Cheryl also shares how she used archives to conduct her research and the challenges she encountered along the way, which then resulted in the formation and her directorship of the Mapping Ontario's Black Archives project. In this first episode, we are introduced to Cheryl and her research, and we learn about how the entertainment infrastructure and blackface's socializing elements helped establish it as a popular form of theater. Okay, Cheryl, welcome to the program.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Sure. So why don't we start with a brief introduction? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your research?
So, I am a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Black expressive culture and creativity. I'm an associate professor in performance as well at the Creative School at Toronto Metropolitan University. I have a PhD in communication studies, an MA in communication and culture, and then an honors BA in criminology. So, needless to say, I have traveled the academic journey to where I am today. And I think what I always like to say when people ask me what my research is that it's kind of all of that. I
Hmm.
really have never left my discipline, all the disciplinary training that I've had. I've never really left it behind. And I sort of look at the production of things through history and how those things entangle with really difficult, complicated conversations of race, of gender, of power, of state, of the local versus the national, the transnational, and how sort of systems of production they actually remain the same, but the things that are produced change
Hmm.
over time.
Hmm.
And that's sort of just what I landed on from that journey from criminology to now being in performance.
Right. So, so we're here to talk about your latest book, and it sounds like kind of all that background converged into the publication of this title, which is Canada and the Blackface Atlantic: Performing Slavery, Conflict, and Freedom, 1812 to 1897. So I'm curious, how did your research kind of lead you to the publication of that book? It's been quite a long project, right?
Yeah, the project really started around 15 years ago.
Hmm.
And at that time it wasn't a book project. It was just a
Right.
project. It
Okay.
was just the project of there's a lot of blackface happening in the contemporary
Hmm.
in Canada and the US in the first decade of the 2000s. That's when the public consciousness seemed to shift, and suddenly if blackface happened it was on the news. It was
Yeah.
like international news. Meanwhile, it never really went away, but for some reason in that decade it was really people were paying attention. So like in the US, in Canada, it was happening at Halloween, it was happening on university campuses. I happened to be living in Montreal at the time, and there was a very public display of blackface at what they called Frosh Week, which is like orientation week for undergraduate students. And a black student at McGill, his name is Anthony Morgan. He's now a very well-known lawyer here in Toronto. He captured it on his phone. So part of this was the digital culture converging.
Hmm.
He
Yep.
captured it on his phone, he posted it online, and then next thing you know, he was on CNN. I still remember Wolf Blitzer was like interviewing him on CNN about this incident. And I thought, wow, this is wild. And I was living in Montreal at the time. So it was not my dissertation research. My dissertation was on Black beauty culture.
Mm.
I thought that's what I was there to study. And I don't know, I guess I realized this about myself with age. I'm just really a creature of my time. Like when things are happening in the time, I'm always kind of just interested in it. So
Mm.
that was happening and I just switched. I continued my dissertation research, but then I just said, you know what? I think I need to understand this more. So I started reading everything there was to read about Blackface. And that's
Mm.
kind of where the book got its origin. It
Okay.
was in that contemporary incident led me to go all the way back, so to speak, like to understand the origins. And then once I understood the origins in the US, I pivoted to say, well, how did this come to Canada? You know,
Hmm.
what's the connection? And I also kind of used it as a pivot point to say, wow, that Anthony Morgan is a Black Canadian in Montreal that suddenly would end up on American TV, broadcast internationally. Like that whole dynamic just really fascinated me.
Hmm. Awesome. So in your introduction in the book, you're presenting the origins of blackface in Canada, but also arguing that blackface was a powerful, quote, socializing agent, which goes a long way to explain its persistence, as you mentioned, even to this day. Can you explain that a little further?
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I like to explain the history of blackface is to you have to think of it in two forms. Like
Mm.
there's the quote unquote theater, like the stage in a place.
Hmm.
And then there's the common in life in the public realm. So a lot of theater historians have typically talked about blackface just as another form of repertoire in the theater, that it's no different than other forms of masking and racial play that you would do in the production of a play,
Right.
right? It had always kind of been sort of like stripped of its social and political import. It was just seen as something that happens in the theater.
Hmm.
There's that aspect. And then there's the aspect of, okay, but the narratives of the minstrel show were so clearly defined as being about slavery
Hmm.
that it would be like, how could you ignore the fact that
Yeah.
Jim Crow, the most famous first minstrel of all, was essentially a caricature of a slave? And how could you ignore the fact that his counterpart, whose name was Zip Coon, was a caricature of a Black person in the North? Like the narrative is so clearly about the American story of slavery and the aftermath of the Civil War that it'd be kind of, it was almost like, okay, we're ignoring the themes so that we don't have to address how this was also training people who were largely illiterate in the 19th century to understand history.
Hmm.
So the minstrel show, why I say it was a socializing agent is because it would depict these complicated narratives, not just related to slavery, but related to the westward expansion of the Union, related to the political tensions that were happening in the time with the Democratic Party and the emergence of the Republican Party. Like it
Hmm.
was explaining really complicated things that if you were not a literate person, you would go to the theater and it was almost like you were getting an education. And you
Right.
can imagine how it, I would almost compare that to in our contemporary, if you don't speak English and you come to the Western world and then you only watch Fox News to learn English, you're going to learn English, but you're also going to learn a particular point of view.
Right.
And you're going to assume that that point of view is the truth because that's the only thing you're seeing. And I
Right.
think that's why the minstrel show was so powerful, because it was the first sort of national American theater that toured the Union, and that also had sort of it created its own repertoire. So you had standard jokes, standard characters, standard themes, that anywhere you lived, everyone was being exposed to the same standard thing,
Hmm.
that over time it sort of became America's theater. And it became the thing that was doing most of the educating until the early 20th century, and policies changed and they implemented public schooling and standard curriculum, and they said that people had to read at a certain level. Like
Right.
all those things that we today completely take for granted as it relates to education really happened in the late 19th, early 20th century when they implemented standards, because they said if we have an illiterate mass, then we really don't have a union because people cannot make conscientious choices
Hmm.
in a democratic state in terms of voting and all the
Hmm.
other things, right? So
Right.
they implemented these standards. Before the standards, the minstrel show was kind of the way people got their education if they were not part of the literate class. And
Right.
the literate class tended to be white, male, upper middle class, highly educated.
Mm.
Because again, at that time, education was not for everyone. There really was no public education. Like the
Right.
public education movement happens in the late 19th, early 20th century. So I think what my book tries to explain is a time in history before all the infrastructure that we kind of take for granted today existed.
Right. So, was that sort of intentional or purposeful in the minstrel shows were they written or created to have an educational component, or is that just kind of how the audience treated them in one respect?
No, absolutely. Most people don't realize that minstrel shows were actually most popular in the Northeast. They really didn't tour the South.
Okay.
Like even though they were depicting the South, the audience was Northerners,
Hmm.
a lot of working class men who were working in the factories, the industrialized North. The minstrel show starts to play a really important role because you have waves of immigration hitting the Northeast, and it's the same thing kind of happening in Canada too, in the cities of Toronto and Montreal in particular. You have waves of immigration from Scotland, from England, from Ireland, from sort of the British Isles in general,
Hmm.
commingling, and then more toward the end of the 19th century, from Italy, from sort of Southern Europe coming, Eastern European Jews coming. You have all these people living in a place, and you can imagine they all don't speak English as a common language yet. They're speaking their native tongues, and they're having to compete with each other for space, for housing, for labor,
Hmm.
for work. And the only thing they're hearing from the dominant media or just conversation is that there are Black people in America who are dangerous. There are Black people in America who are slaves.
Hmm.
And so the minstrel show starts to take on this role of just reinforcing the mythology of you should fear the Black person.
Okay.
And at the same time, you should fear the Black person specifically in the North who is becoming literate, who's wearing a suit, who's sort of acting as if they have achieved something. You should really fear that person. Who you should really like and love is the Southern errant slave who loves to tell jokes and loves to sit around and is so lazy and doesn't do anything. The minstrel show really created this bifurcated identity where people actually, and it's still in the ether today, where we are, if we see, that's, President Barack Obama really had this issue. It's like too well dressed, too well spoken. He's not authentic.
Mm. Right.
Right? And then who do they want to invite to the White House now? They just want to invite the rapper, somebody who's real, somebody who acts quote unquote Black, who doesn't speak well, literally, who isn't educated. Oh, we
Mm.
love him so much. They don't understand that that comes from somewhere. And the minstrel show is the origin of pitting those two archetypes as if they could not be the same person. Like they have to be two separate people
Right.
in not just in terms of how they act and dress, but also in geography. That there's a geographic Blackness
Hmm.
that that presents itself a certain way. So you can imagine in the context when in writing this book, I had to learn all of that, right? I really didn't know all of that in depth, and I wasn't really thinking about how class then is sort of another metric that you need to analyze this topic, you cannot just think about race,
Hmm.
because there is a class component and there's also a geographic component, because the minstrel show really was different depending on where it was performed.
Okay. So you mentioned infrastructure a little while ago that comes into play. And there is, a key element in your book that relates to infrastructure. That the story of blackface in Canada is also one of infrastructure that supported and grew the entertainment industry itself. Um, how did you kind of come upon that as an important element in your book?
Yeah, I mean, funny story there. I can't remember where I was or what happened, but I kind of told them that I was interested in studying theater,
Hmm.
and it was just a random who said, "Well, you need to study the railroad." I'm like, "Oh, okay, I never thought of that." So the first thing I did when I heard that, here in Toronto, we have a railroad museum.
Hmm.
I actually went to the museum. I just said, "Okay, well, let me just go to the museum and see how they present this topic." And it was actually the moment of, oh wow, they really do sanitize the railroad history, and they don't really talk much about who built the railroad, and they also don't talk about who worked on the railroad serving people. They
Mm.
just focused on the conductors and the stations, and how this in Canada the railroad was a project of nation building, because we are a vast country. We're actually bigger than the US in terms of landmass,
Yep.
right?
Hmm.
Very vast country. So the question of Canada's identity in the 19th century is, how are we going to make all of this one? And so I came to understand that the railroad was the key building to connect coast to coast,
Okay.
so that people can move coast to coast. And also, where in the US narrative of Western expansion, you sort of have the mythology of people on a stagecoach, or like people on the big horses going west and discovering all these places, even though the Native Americans already lived there.
Hmm.
But that's another side story.
Right.
In Canada, our terrain and weather is kind of prohibitive for that kind of movement west.
Hmm.
So building the railroad west was fundamental to Western Canada. Like, we wouldn't have a Western Canada if we didn't have that transportation. And what that meant then is, once everything was linked, and then we linked intercontinentally with the US, with states like Michigan and New York and Minnesota and Pennsylvania, that meant that now, and again, sort of toward the 1870s, 1880s, the actual coaches on the train got bigger, that they could carry sets and they could carry the actual things you would need to put on a show. So as that happened, Canada was like open frontier for
Yeah.
entertainers,
Right.
right? Like, because there's so many cities in the sort of the southern, especially in Ontario, the southern Ontario corridor, which is really from Windsor across the border from Detroit right through to Ottawa. There are so many cities and little towns that, back then there was an unmonitored border. I mean, you could really just cross over, and you would have a field day in terms of performance, because the train would stop at all those little towns and
Right.
all the little
Okay.
cities. And if you're doing back then, there's a reason the 19th century performer, if they hit 50, that was a miracle, because they did one nighters. Like, that was the gig. You
Hmm.
travel to a town, you set up, you do the show, you get on whatever it was, and you're doing the show the next day. Like, they had no breaks. Basically, it was like city to town to city to town. So the train is so vital to the story. And I don't think I would have learned that if I didn't go to the museum and have that such a visceral reaction to not seeing the whole story of the railroad. It's like
Right.
I saw like the official story.
Right. And how integral that was to importing, minstrelsy
Well,
up to.
more so, I think, as a writer, at least for me as a writer, I'm always interested in the disjuncture between the official story and what I'm finding in the archive.
Right.
Right? Because there's usually a huge gap between what you're always been told and what everyone thinks to be true. And then
Hmm.
when you go to the primary source, you look at the record, you look at the reporting in the newspaper back in whatever time it was,
Yep.
and you're like, wow, the official record is not talking about this.
Mm.
I just happen to be one of those people um, who likes to talk about that,
Yeah,
to point to what I think is missing in the conversation.
I get it. Okay, excellent. You just heard from Dr. Cheryl Thompson, Associate Professor in Performance at the Creative School at Toronto Metropolitan University, Director of Mapping Ontario's Black Archives, and author of Canada and the Blackface Atlantic, Performing Slavery, Conflict, and Freedom, 1812 to 1897. Join us next week when we dig deeper into Cheryl's book and learn about the connections between conflict and entertainment and how the portrayal of Black people in minstrel shows reflected attitudes about American enslavement in the U.S. North and South. This series is underwritten with generous support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.